that.
Okay, we are now recording.
Okay, fantastic. So welcome everybody. I'm Claire Gillis. I'm a board member of the Wyndham World Affairs Council, and I'll be moderating our talk today. Jennifer Ambler will be handling the technical side of this talk. Jennifer, do you want to say hello? You could also pop your face up there if you want.
Hi, this is my first time doing Wyndham World Affairs Council, but I do Center Congregational Church every Sunday morning, so hopefully this will go smoothly.
Excellent. You and Scott are a good team. So today we are absolutely delighted to welcome our fellow Wyndham World Affairs board member, the Reverend Dr. Scott Couper, who will tell us about the South African anti-apartheid politician Albert Luthuli, who was the first Black African to receive the Nobel Prize. And we have another very special guest today who's joining us all the way from South Africa, Ayanda Simelane. I hope I pronounced your name right. She is a historian and museum curator there, and she'll offer a response to Scott's talk. So Scott, who many of you may know in his capacity as minister of the Center Congregational Church in Brattleboro, brings a deep knowledge and experience of South Africa to this subject. He lived there for 2 decades and performed a variety of roles. He served as an ordained minister of several rural Zulu congregations, and he also served the African Church as an HIV and AIDS project coordinator during the height of the global pandemic in the continent that was hardest hit by it. Scott became interested in Luthuli's story while ministering in Groutville in South Africa in a church that had actually been Luthuli's church. And it turned out that he found Luthuli such a compelling figure that he undertook a PhD in history researching his life. He completed that degree in 2008 at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban, South Africa. And he published his dissertation as a book, and it remains to this day the sole substantive biography of Luthuli. After completing that degree, he became an archivist and museum curator at the historic Ayanda Seminary. Scott also taught theology at the Seth Mokatimi Methodist Seminary and history at the University of KwaZulu-Natal before moving to Brattleboro in 2018. Scott's biography of Luthuli was initially greeted with great public criticism, skepticism from South Africa's African National Congress political elite, but his archival primary source evidence and arguments eventually persuaded academics throughout South Africa, and the critical reevaluation that he urged is now widely taught in South African curricula. And I'll also offer a note of congratulations to Scott, as he just got married last week. Congratulations, Scott. And Ayanda, who will respond to Scott's talk, is from Ayanda herself. And we're going to hear more, I believe, about Ayanda and its importance in the fight against apartheid. And in Ayanda, there was a community of maNgcobo, which produced prominent male figures in South African resistance history. Ayanda was home to Pixley Kalsaka Seme and John Langa Libalele Dube, 2 of the founding members of what would become the African National Congress. Ayanda earned a cultural and heritage tourism undergraduate degree and a public policy honors degree at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Her undergraduate studies exposed her to leading figures in the history of African nationalism who were honored through heritage sites. And she and Scott met in Durban when he was invited to do a presentation on his Luthuli biography. And she later started working with him in the Ayanda Seminary. Ayanda is currently studying for her master's degree in history at the University of Western Cape and focuses on biographical approaches to resistance histories. Ayanda is a museum officer for eThekwini Municipality's Durban Local History Museums in South Africa. She is also the chairperson for the KwaZulu-Natal region of the South African Museums Association. And she's worked in the heritage sector For over 5 years, has participated widely in conferences and workshops, as well as publishing a number of articles on topics relating to public history and museum collections. And before we move to this event, I want to let you know briefly about our next event, which will take place on Sunday, March 7th at this same time, 4 to 5:30 p.m., also on Zoom. And the event commemorates the 10-year anniversary of the beginning of the ongoing disaster at the Fukushima nuclear plant in Japan. Chiho Kaneko and Professor Norma Field of the University of Chicago, two Japanese American women with strong ties to the Fukushima region, will hold a discussion in a conversational format on the sociological, environmental, economic, and political impact of this ongoing crisis. And they will also consider what it means for Japan as the country prepares for the 2021 Olympic Games in Tokyo. Like all of our events, this talk is free and open to the public. The Wyndham World Affairs Council is the smallest member of the national organization and the only one run entirely by volunteers. Annual memberships support the operating costs of the WWAC. And if you're interested in becoming a member, you can go to our website, Wyndham World Affairs Council.org. I've got a few housekeeping notes. So the talk will be followed as normal by a community Q&A. We are currently recording and the video will be available on YouTube after the event. If you want to ask a question, we really want to hear your questions. Please make sure to use the Q&A function in Zoom. Please do not use the chat function. And if you'd like to include your name and where you're writing from, we like that so we know who we're talking to. And finally, thank you so much for joining us today. And I give you the Reverend Dr. Scott Couper.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. I hope that everyone can see me and hear me clearly. I had an unstable internet connection, so I switched to my cell phone, and hopefully this will be secure. Claire, can I just get an okay from you that everyone can see and hear me? Fantastic, fantastic. Well, let's just get started. To preface my remarks this afternoon, I would like to recall two memories that are forever burned into my consciousness. In 2010, just days after submitting the final manuscript of my book, I saw in the biographical section of exclusive books, Nelson Mandela's text, Conversations with Myself, that had just been released, hot off the press in the bookstore. I froze as I saw this text. I was really afraid to open his book. Yet, I took off my coat, I plopped right down on the floor, right then and there, with people walking all around me. I was obsessed and I rifled through the book. I frantically switched back and forth from the index to the main text. I feared that Mandela presented new evidence that supported the long-held assertion, which I felt was incorrect, that in 1961, the President General of the African National Congress and recent winner of the 1960 Nobel Peace Prize, Albert Luthuli, supported and authorized Mandela to activate, with a series of bombings across South Africa, maNgcobo, the Army of Liberation. I feared Mandela presented evidence that contradicted the assertion presented in my book, Albert Luthuli, bound by faith, that Luthuli did not authorize or support the violent struggle that Mandela initiated. You see, every good historian worth his or her salt knows that he or she never has the final word. Because new evidence is always revealed, previous understandings are rendered at best passé and obsolete, and at worst, flat out wrong. Therefore, the first biographies of any historical figure are by default the most vulnerable to being inaccurate. Evidence from Mandela's text would have been the death knell of my book. For Mandela's texts was archival material sourced from the 1960s. Mandela had more authority than I, and his text was written as events unfolded, rather than my text written 50 years later. But to my massive relief, sitting there in that bookstore on the floor, rifling through his book, Mandela's 1960s voice, now published in his text, did not contradict my thesis. In fact, to my enormous relief, Mandela's book affirmed my thesis and contradicted his own ghost-written voice, heard in his 1994 autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, which, for all intents and purposes, sort of regurgitated the narrative that had always been told, that Luthuli supported Mandela's launch of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the violent struggle. Also, in 2010, that same year, I found myself sweating bullets in the Chief Albert Luthuli Conference Center in Durban, South Africa. The president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, with his heavily armed entourage, stopped at my publisher's table, gazed at my books on display for purchase, and pounded his finger on a copy of my book and ominously declared, this is what I'm talking about. And thereafter, I sat frightened in the audience as Zuma, in a nationally televised address, denounced the conclusions of my book and repudiated the findings of my 10 years of research about my ecclesiastical and faith hero, Albert Luthuli, for which I earned a PhD. Why was I terrified? Why was Zuma so upset? Well, after only 16 years following independence, I overturned the mythologized nationalist history of one of South Africa's greatest founding fathers, Albert Luthuli, and thus, with other scholars, collectively upended the same mythologized nationalist history of South Africa. The most well-known hero, Nelson Mandela. I sort of messed with the pantheon of South Africa's founding fathers. I committed political heresy. For another 8 years, I defended my thesis. I defended my thesis not against academics who had since first reading accepted and quietly applauded the archival evidence supporting my conclusions. Rather, I defended my thesis against politicians, particularly ANC politicians, who, not being historians, were not necessarily beholden to facts or evidence, but rather were wedded, in fact, grafted to mythologies, ideologies, and cults of personalities. Sound familiar? It happens in our own country too. In a lecture on Albert Luthuli, the worst possible thing I can do in 15 minutes or less is to try to summarize his autobiography or my 200 page plus biography. If I were to do that, one, I would do an injustice to the great man's life, and two, I would risk boring all of you to tears. As one favorite historian of mine once said, history, even if it is an interesting biography, is not recounting one damn thing after another. Therefore, I will limit my recounting of Luthuli's life to that which is relevant to this lecture on democracy and the implications it has for us today in the United States. As I listened to Donald Trump's second impeachment hearings while drafting this very lecture, it was made clear to me that many lessons need to be learned in the United States. Albert Luthuli's grandfather was a 19th century convert of a Congregationalist missionary and had, among others, two sons, John and Martin. John's son, Albert Luthuli, was born in the late 1890s in Rhodesia, in what is now known as Zimbabwe. John died soon after Albert's birth, and Albert migrated with his family to his family's South African ancestral home, Groutville. Martin, John's brother and Albert's uncle, was the local chief of Groutville, and for all intents and purposes, adopted the young Albert. What is important to note about Albert's early life is that he received his primary high school and vocational education from American missionaries. Albert's church was founded by Americans, and his most influential ministers and teachers were Americans. Albert even received his health care from American congregational doctors at Durban's Mission Hospital. Albert's American influence was not unusual. For Pixley Kaazake Seme, the founder of the ANC, also had a similar background, even schooling at Columbia University. And John Dube, the first president of the African National Congress, schooled at Oberlin College in Ohio. So the founder, the first president, and the Nobel Peace Prize winner, all ANC presidents, all had formative American backgrounds. Luthuli traveled abroad twice. Prior to his 1961 trip to Oslo to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. The first time was in 1938, when Luthuli attended the International Missionary Conference near Madras, India. I think now it's known as Chennai. It likely did not surprise Luthuli that segregation was practiced by his white Christian colleagues on their passage, on their way to India. Yet in India, the conference was a revelation for Luthuli because segregation was not practiced by the wider Christian church. And he thus became an incisive critic of the racist church in South Africa. Luthuli tells us in his autobiography that on the voyage home, the white delegation felt obliged to suspend segregation on board until they reached South African shores. And Luthuli dryly quipped in his autobiography, quote, "And the boat did not sink," unquote. While Luthuli did not meet Mohandas Gandhi, it was in India that Luthuli became exposed to him. When Luthuli did not become a philosophical, while Luthuli did not become a philosophical or ideological disciple of Gandhi, that is, a strict pacifist, he did, however, like Martin Luther King Jr., become a disciple of Gandhi's in the realm of nonviolent strategies and tactics. Albert Luthuli's second sojourn abroad was to the United States on a 9-month speaking tour in 1948. Luthuli's tour had him speak primarily in New England and the Midwest. Yet Luthuli extended his stay to visit the South. And no doubt Luthuli observed and even perhaps experienced the segregationist South with its Jim Crow version of white supremacy. After Luthuli returned to the United States, he quickly rose to national prominence within the ANC on the provincial and then national level. Luthuli's autobiographical amanuensis wrote, quote, "Assurance and humility stand Luthuli and his country in good stead, as do other of his qualities: resilience, youthfulness of spirit, undauntable courage, wisdom, tolerance, charity, a zest for living, patience. If there is one quality associated with leadership which he lacks, it is ambition. There is behind him no struggle for power, and within him no determination to rule in person," unquote. In May 1951, Luthuli won an election that placed him as the leader of the ANC in his province. Luthuli's leadership of the 1952 Defiance campaign that sought to flood and overwhelm the South African judicial system with violators of petty apartheid restrictions propelled Luthuli to the top of ANC leadership. And what is Luthuli's most famous declaration? He said that the road to freedom is via the cross. And he said that he would risk his livelihood and even his life for the fortunes of his fellow citizens of color. Very soon thereafter, he was fired from the government, from his post as a leader of a Christian community that democratically elected him. Following his ousting as a community leader, younger, more militant members of the ANC, Nelson Mandela included, saw in Luthuli a brave man of principles. As a lay minister, Luthuli was a gifted orator. Though he forfeited a scholarship that would have allowed him to earn a bachelor's degree, Luthuli was an educator by trade, and he thus was highly self-educated. In December 1952, Luthuli was elected President General of the African National Congress. Luthuli's rise can only be described as meteoric. Within just a few years, he became the leader of Southern Africa's largest liberation movement. Many historic events occurred during the first 12 years of Albert Luthuli's tenure as President General of the ANC. For starters, the apartheid regime repeatedly banned Luthuli, rendering him isolated. Bannings essentially placed Luthuli under house arrest and permitted only 3 people at a time in a room with him. By the end of his life, his bannings had become so severe that they actually caused what some refer to as a social death. It was illegal to even publish a quote or show an image of Luthuli. Luthuli presided over the ANC during its most tumultuous times that we can only name and not really recount for lack of time. The infamous treason trial from 56 to 61, the horrific Sharpeville massacre in 1960, the banning of the South African Communist Party and the ANC, the formation of maNgcobo, the armed liberation movement, and the announcement and awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize, and the beginning of the armed struggle, and the quick decimation of the liberation movement, when most, if not all, leaders were arrested, jailed, killed, or exiled in 1962. Also, the arrest of Nelson Mandela in that same year, and the sentencing to life imprisonment of Mandela and others in the Rivonia trial of 1964. I intended my book to be an ecclesiastical biography of a great man of peace. I intended my book actually to be for the benefit of the South African and United States churches that groomed Luthuli and I. Yet, unfortunately, the book became almost a political scandal that drew the ire of the Luthuli family, the board of the Luthuli Museum, the Minister of Arts and Culture, Paulo Jordan, and even the President of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, as I mentioned in the preface to my remarks. Unbeknownst to me, I messed with the founding fathers of the country. I subverted an ANC nationalist narrative that had been told and heard so many times that it had become indisputable truth. Yet, that ANC nationalist narrative was not the truth. While my book seemed to have dozens of lightning rods, this afternoon I will mention only one. In 2008, I traveled to the ANC archives at Fort Hare University. There I read exhibition panels that obviously sought to graft into a seamless succession Luthuli to Mandela and Mandela to Luthuli. One panel read, quote, "In June 1961, when Nelson Mandela introduced the idea of an armed struggle at an ANC meeting, Mandela was concerned that because Luthuli was committed to nonviolence, he might be reluctant to agree. After listening to hours of motivation, Luthuli finally agreed that the armed struggle was inevitable, unquote. Now, the history is that Albert Luthuli then traveled to Oslo, accepted the Nobel Peace Prize specifically for his past, present, and future promise to continue the liberation struggle without violence. I knew the history I just quoted was simplistic, inaccurate, misleading, and untrue. And I had mountains of archival evidence, much of it from Luthuli's own pen, proving Luthuli remained committed to the nonviolent struggle against white supremacy after Mandela launched the armed struggle. What actually happened in 1961 is Nelson Mandela led an internal coup against Albert Luthuli. On the very night of Luthuli's return from accepting the Nobel Peace Prize, Mandela set off bombs across South Africa, thus launching the armed struggle without Luthuli's knowledge or permission, despite the fact that Luthuli was the President General of the ANC and the leader of that liberation movement. Mandela was insubordinate. Mandela humiliated Luthuli. Mandela rendered Luthuli's nonviolent struggle obsolete and destroyed at the precise moment that the ANC could have moved forward with the nonviolent movement, having just won the Nobel Peace Prize. With Mandela's war, the prize became worthless, and its winner, Luthuli, was effectively from that point on put out to pasture the night he returned from receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. Mandela, with bombs, won the debate with Luthuli and rendered him obsolete. Albert Luthuli departed the United States and returned to South Africa in the wake of its 1948 election that was eerily similar to the 2016 election won by Donald Trump. For example, the 1948 and the 2016 results were very unexpected. The nationalists in South Africa who implemented apartheid and the Republicans won by razor-thin margins. The United and the Democratic parties won the popular vote, but lost the election. Turnout for a radicalized conservative base was unexpectedly high in both elections. In the case of South Africa, parliamentary coalitions were counted in ways to enable the nationalists to gain power And in the United States, voting districts were sufficiently gerrymandered, and the manner in which winner-take-all electoral ballots were tabulated paved the way for Donald Trump to occupy the White House. After the 1948 election win, the nationalists legislated apartheid, a draconian form of segregation and oppression against people of color. Arguably, much the same happened in the USA after the 2016 election. The Republicans' MAGA mandate included, right off the bat, a Muslim ban, the construction of an anti-immigrant wall, and numerous pieces of legislation to return the country to a patriarchal, white supremacist, and gender binaried rule. I believe had Donald Trump been elected for a second term in 2020, we would have inaugurated a nationalist regime that would have, yes, in a 20th century form, ushered in a 21st century form, would have ushered in a racist, anti-immigrant, fascist, and undemocratic state, captured for all intents and purposes by a cult of personality. As a historian, I am convinced that Trump exhibited all the signs of a megalomaniac, concerned only with his own power and greed, and not at all with others, let alone our country's democracy. Albert Luthuli is a figure who demonstrates that a student often learns lessons taught by one's teachers better than the teachers themselves. As I mentioned, Luthuli was born, bred, and died within the bosom of American Congregationalism. Yes, Luthuli was a proud Black Zulu African, no doubt about it. Yet though Black, he believed in the equality of all races. Though Zulu, Luthuli did not bow to patriarchy, hierarchy, or hereditary rule. Luthuli felt himself a beneficiary and contributor to civilization, to which all the cultures of the world, given the opportunity, graft themselves to. Luthuli understood that all cultures take the best of what civilization has to offer and discards that which is harmful. Luthuli believed that Zulus ought to discard the worst that Zulu culture has to offer civilization and contribute its best. Albert Luthuli admired democracy as a valuable characteristic of civilization. Luthuli rightfully did not believe democracy was inherent to Western society, nor absent in traditional African societies. Democracy, Luthuli believed, certainly should not be monopolized by whites and withheld from Blacks, as the apartheid regime did. As a Black Zulu African, Luthuli was, above all, a Democrat. From Luthuli's life, I have discerned three characteristics he embodied and taught regarding democracy. One, egalitarianism or meritocracy. Two, education. and 3 human rights. I will comment on them briefly. Similar to the North American tradition, very imperfectly lived out, the South African mantra, one man, one vote, understands that all men are created equal. Inherent within democracy is the opportunity for people to realize their God-given potential. In other words, for Albert Luthuli, egalitarianism is a fundamental principle of democracy. Luthuli grew up in the bosom of the Congregational Church that emphasized an extraordinarily high degree of egalitarianism, utilizing a very flat polity whereby the membership of the church hires and fires its minister. There is little or no hierarchy. And if there is a hierarchy, it's sort of an inverted pyramid whereby the people have the power democratically and the leader is but a hired hand or a servant. Even as a local chief, Luthuli's role was bestowed upon him by vote and not by inheritance, as is the case in most traditional African societies. Luthuli advocated for the equal rights of women. During the 1956 Women's March in Pretoria, he praised the bravery and leadership of women in contrast to the menfolk. Nokukanya, his wife, was a co-equal partner with him during his political life. Equally educated, equally intelligent, and equally wise. Luthuli did not wish to impose a Black rule in South Africa as much as he did not wish to acquiesce to white rule. And Luthuli did not give greater deference to those with more wealth or who belonged to a higher class or who were privileged with more education than he did to a simple farmer, which in fact he was. Though an egalitarian, Luthuli was a capitalist, and he thus believed in a meritocracy, whereby hard work, savings, initiative, and ability pay positive dividends. Though Luthuli allied the ANC with the South African Communist Party, Luthuli himself did not ascribe to communism. Luthuli called himself a democratic socialist. Perhaps we'll go on to the next slide. For Albert Luthuli, a second characteristic of a healthy and vibrant democracy is education. The Congregational Church founded in North America Harvard, Yale, and Dartmouth universities, and has always valued amongst its ordained clergy high and broad education. It makes a great deal of sense for a church with a highly democratic polity to require of its constituents a very high level of education. Likewise, any democratic country worth its salt realizes that education is a crucial ingredient for an effective democracy. If the people are to govern themselves, they must be enlightened. Of course, education alone is not a prerequisite for a responsible citizen or an effective government, but it certainly helps. The Congregational Mission Station in Groutville gifted Luthuli with an excellent education. He later attended Adams College, another congregational institution, Luthuli was offered a scholarship to study at the country's only college for Blacks, but declined in order to work and support his aging mother. Though Luthuli was a farmer and politician, he was a better educator. He was certainly a better teacher, vocationally speaking, than a farmer or politician. While there are no guarantees, Albert Luthuli would hope that a high value placed upon egalitarianism and education would foster an emphasis on human rights, thus enabling a healthy democracy. Again, as with egalitarianism and education, Congregationalism has historically emphasized human rights or the establishment of justice as a key tenet. While few, if any, churches or governments actually live up to their most benevolent ideals, Congregationalism has been on the forefront of many social justice issues over the last 3 centuries. Congregationalism played a substantive part in the American Revolution. Many abolitionists were Congregationalists. Congregationalists played a prominent role in the case of the Amistad. Congregationalists were the first to ordain women when it was unheard of in the 1800s. Congregationalists were the first to ordain gay men and women into the ministry in the 1970s, when most churches were decades away from even wrestling with the issue. Even today, the United Church of Christ remains one of the, if not the most, prophetic mainline Protestant denominations on the forefront of many social justice issues around the world. Christian Congregationalism instilled in Albert Luthuli the understanding that there can be no preaching and demonstrating the gospel without involvement in politics. The gospel, he would assert, is inherently political. Hence, Luthuli once famously stated, quote, "I am in the African National Congress because I am a Christian." Following on South Africa's democratic transition, how do we in North America emerge from the last 4 years of Donald Trump? Trump was only a catalyst, igniting long existing ingredients required for society's regression. All these ingredients existed in South Africa under colonialism and nationalism. Taking Black Lives Matter as an example, this past year demonstrated that the United States is still fighting the Civil War. How long will South Africa continue to fight apartheid? One means by which South Africa hoped to end its civil war was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. I feel the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was successful to the extent that it enabled, through catharsis, a new democracy to emerge with some collective understanding that the apartheid regime was immoral. However, South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a greater failure in the sense of not enabling the country to move away from white supremacy, especially as it regards possession of land and money. Like the United States, South Africa is likely to fight a civil war over decades, if not centuries. South Africa teaches the United States, and the United States teaches South Africa, that there can be no peace without justice. No justice, no peace. Reconciliation is not simply a matter of Blacks forgiving whites, but it is a process whereby whites sacrifice to provide restitution, if not reparations, to Blacks for the harm whites have caused. That is, reconciliation cannot be one way. Reconciliation must be two ways. Both sides must risk. There must be, in theological terms, repentance in the United States for there to be true reconciliation. Sadly, the era of Trump has caused us to move further away from repentance, reparations, and restitution. We are as far away as ever. To conclude this lecture, I would like to leave us with two lessons I have learned from Albert Luthuli. I believe these two lessons center around the primary theme of idolatry. I understand Albert Luthuli cautions us to avoid being primarily accountable to a political party. Luthuli held himself primarily accountable to values, which were premised on his faith. And he engendered a great deal from his particular brand of faith, Congregationalism. These values are that which Luthuli bound himself to. Luthuli did not support the direction of the African National Congress. After Mandela, without Luthuli's permission or knowledge, launched the armed struggle. And Luthuli disagreed, although not openly, with the African National Congress, even though he loved it, and even while he led it. Within any nation, there is always a gradual, slippery slope whereby its constituency makes a given political party an idol to be worshipped, and to which they hold themselves primarily accountable. All political parties can deviate and can even legislate in opposition to their previously claimed values. Luthuli teaches us to adhere to values and ideals rather than to political partisan expediency. Luthuli adhered to his values and advocated nonviolence as a political strategy to liberate South Africa. Luthuli did not simply agree with, implement, and support the African National Congress's turn to violent methods under Mandela's direction, even while he led, though in name only, the same organization until his death. Third, and finally, Luthuli teaches us to avoid the cult of personality, be it Trump's or Mandela's. When teaching about the cult of personality in my lectures, I like to have my students listen to the song entitled "The Same." It's a song sung by African-American hard rock group Living Colour. And I will conclude with some of its lyrics. Look in my eyes. What do you see? The cult of personality. I know your anger. I know your dreams. I've been everything you want to be. I'm the cult of personality. Like Mussolini and Kennedy, I am the cult of personality. Neon lights, a Nobel Prize. Then a mirror speaks. The reflection lies. You don't have to follow me. Only you can set me free. I sell the things you need to be. I'm the smiling face on your TV. I'm the cult of personality. I exploit you. You still love me. I tell you 1 and 1 makes 3. I'm the cult of personality, like Joseph Stalin and Gandhi. I'm the cult of personality. Neon lights, a Nobel Prize. A leader speaks, that leader dies. You don't have to follow me. Only you can set you free. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott. That was really great. Ayanda, I will turn it directly over to you.
Good evening, everyone. As introduced, I'm Ayanda maNgcobo. I will be giving the South African perspective under the topic Lessons of Democracy. Bound by Faith, the biography of Albert Luthuli. The book spurred debates in relation to the history of the ANC and its alliances. The book was not acceptable to the ANC leadership, the Luthuli family, and the leadership of the Luthuli Museum. The main arguments that Couper raises in the book are centered around how Albert Luthuli was steadfast in his Christian beliefs and had immovable faith. The emphasis was on how resistant histories have been mythologized. The book challenges dominant narratives. These narratives also become part of museum displays. In the book, Couper reveals that Nelson Mandela went against his leader, Luthuli, in launching Umkhonto weSizwe, in short, MK. The book presented different conclusions about Luthuli's death. The book was publicly criticized by political leaders, but silently praised by academics. Looking at some of the reviews, Nicholas Southey, in his review, stated that the book is provocative and engages directly with conventional and convenient wisdom, and concluded that it is an important contribution to the writing of the 1950s and 1960s. Suyakanti Chetty said that the book portrays a complex but deeply consistent man who was motivated by his spiritual concerns over his political ones. Mandela and Luthuli had little in common. To acknowledge this difference between them is not to either a disservice, but to present a more nuanced account of the country's long struggle towards freedom. Looking at Luthuli's term as ANC president, it was a very eventful time in South Africa. Bantu education was introduced. Bantu education ensured that Black people and white people received different levels of education. Bantu education was designed to indoctrinate Black people's minds that to accept, it was designed to indoctrinate Black people to accept white supremacy and also recognize it. A violation of human rights also took place during his time, as noted in 1960 in the Sharpeville massacre. Women's March also happened during his term, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize, and MK was also launched. Okay, reflecting on Trump's elections. Well, South Africans had a lot to say on Twitter when Trump was trending. Looking at Donald Trump, he defies Luthuli's key beliefs, which became part of South Africa's goals in rebuilding the country. Donald Trump became a reminder of apartheid leaders. when it was announced that Donald Trump is the new president of the United States of America, it was a huge shock in the South African community. It was a huge shock considering that Americans are sophisticated and advanced as presented in the media. A lot looked at it as a reflection on the American society, that the American society is not what is being sold to the world. There are bullies, racist, and ignorant, like Trump. Stephen Bantu Biko and Chris Simelane were major threats to the apartheid government. The apartheid government could not let them live because they were bigger threats than Nelson Mandela, and that's why they were killed. Stephen Bantu Biko was the leader of the Black consciousness movement, believing that liberated. Chris Hani did not agree with most of what was negotiated when there were plans for a democratic South Africa. He believed in social justice. Looking at the birth of democracy, Nelson Mandela cast his first votes at the home of John Langalibalele Dube. Nelson Mandela recognized the importance of early leadership of the ANC and honored them, and also recognized the importance of the mass majority in activism against apartheid. The focus of Mandela's term from 1994 was on reconciliation and reconstruction. A new constitution was signed in 1996 at the site of the Sharpeville massacre. The constitution was one of the best in the world. He became known as part of the nation who delivered South Africa from the evils of apartheid. However, in recent years, there's been questions about the leadership of Mandela. It has been criticized for failure to prioritize the vast majority in the negotiations for the democratic South Africa. It has also been criticized for lack of implementation of effective transformation, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did not produce perceived results. Because in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you had so-called perpetrators coming forward with the evidence. So people didn't believe that it was really the truth. And white people still enjoyed some privileges over Black people. Looking at Luthuli's key aspects and comparison and against South Africa's democracy in present day, well, one of his key aspects was egalitarianism. White South Africans are not ready to admit the degree of white privilege. Affirmative action and Black economic empowerment were policies passed to redress past imbalances. However, the economy is still in the hands of the minority. The country's natural resources are not in the hands of the people. There is a wide inequality gap between the haves and the have-nots. The second being education. More Black South Africans are now in what was known as white schools in apartheid government. Government pays for meals and stationery in public schools, and in real schools, fees are not payable. However, tertiary education is still not affordable. In 2015, there have been huge protest movements from tertiary students up against the fees. So they were probably known as fees must fall, and there were also roads must fall, which were emphasizing the importance of reconstructing the tertiary institutions. And after that, there was an increase in budget for student funding. However, quality education is still not up to standard. In closing, I'll look at human rights. South Africa is faced with the scourge of gender-based rights. Racism is still relatively high, and there has been deficiencies on policy implementations on the side of the government. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ayanda. Scott, you can come back. We will launch our Q&A. You've given us a lot to think about. So I'd like to start with a question from Maya Segura, who's a fellow Wyndham World Affairs Council board member. And this is for Scott. Why do you think that the ANC and Mandela felt compelled to oust Luthuli on the eve of his award? Why was that timing so critical?
Sure, that's a great question. Of course, interpretation is always key for any historian, but chronology is also very, very important to understand. So let's just look at the chronology. We had Sharpeville early in 1960. We had the banning of the ANC and the banning of the South African Communist Party. Those parties weren't even allowed to legally meet anymore. Now, what happened is during these underground meetings, there was a debate. Mandela believed that an armed struggle was inevitable and that we need to prepare for it. Luthuli and his allies were against an armed struggle and believed that nonviolent means could still be pursued. Mandela had a very good argument, and that the more the ANC was nonviolent, the more repressive the apartheid regime became. So Mandela was winning the argument. And what eventually happened is that Luthuli acquiesced to the formation of maNgcobo. In other words, the argument was, okay, well, if we come to the end of the road and if there is no other option other than violence, at least we will have something in place in which to sort of responsibly launch that violence. So Luthuli acquiesced to Mandela forming an organization. But what happened after that is the Nobel Peace Prize was announced to have been awarded to Albert Luthuli in the ANC. And so Albert Luthuli went to Scandinavia, and he went and he, of course, the entire 2 weeks he was there, he argued vociferously for the maintenance of the nonviolent struggle. And in fact, he says, now with the Nobel Peace Prize, we are on the front pages of every single global newspaper. Now we have the bullet pulpit. Now the apartheid regime is the polecat of the world. Now is when we can effectively use nonviolent strategies. So what had happened was the argument turned away from Mandela and then turned towards Luthuli. So if Luthuli was going to enter into the country, having just won the Nobel Peace Prize, that would give Luthuli greater weight and greater persuasive powers within the ANC. But Mandela said, if we're going to go for the armed struggle, which I have just been preparing for the last 6 months, then I need to short circuit Luthuli. I need to nip him in the bud. And so on the night that Luthuli came back from the Nobel Peace Prize, maNgcobo set off bombs across South Africa, thus declaring the nonviolent struggle impossible for all intents and purposes. So the issue was timing. I think Mandela knew that he would lose the argument with Albert Luthuli in the country, having just won the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the ANC. And Mandela had to neutralize it in order to win the argument, so to speak.
Yeah, following up on that, a question from another board member, Lissa Weinman. Do you think the Peace Prize would have made a real difference? And why wouldn't Mandela have wanted to harness that too? Or are you just saying that Mandela was power hungry, more of an egotist at heart? Is that what you're getting at?
No, I actually, in my book, nor personally, I believe that Mandela and Luthuli believed in good faith and argued in good faith their respective positions. There was as I said, Mandela had a great argument. There was really nothing that was going to persuade the apartheid regime to forfeit white supremacy. But Luthuli on his side believed that by pursuing non-violent means, that would keep the Western democracies on the ANC's side, and that would eventually allow the ANC to actually win liberation for the country. What happened was that Mandela, by going for the armed option, which may in theory have been the right one, it forced the ANC to go into the bosom of the Soviet bloc. And so we have to remember that South Africa is involved in a proxy Cold War. And when you go for non-violence, you can be on the side of the Western democracies who eventually won the Cold War. If you go for the violent option, you're pushing yourself into the Soviet bloc. And what happened is, I believe that by going into the Soviet bloc, it actually delayed South Africa's liberation by years, if not decades. Because guess when the ANC was able to gain power of South Africa? It's when the Cold War ended. It's when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet bloc could no longer support the ANC. And so I really believe that Luthuli, in part, believed in nonviolence because he wanted to be allied with the Western democracies. By going the violent route, you ally yourself with the Soviet bloc. And what eventually happened was the Soviet bloc ended up on the wrong side of history, and South Africa had to wait for its liberation until the Western democracies came on board the ANC's side.
Okay, thanks for that. Ayanda, I have a question for you. I love hearing from both of you folks as fellow historians. I'm very curious about your experience working in museums in South Africa. What kinds of, because of course history is a living thing, the stories that we tell now change all the time. And I'm wondering what kind of changes you've seen in terms of museum practice as the place that the public interacts with the academic, professionalized version of history. I'm wondering what kind of changes you've seen in the time that you've been working in that field.
Okay, so museums in South Africa have also been a reflection of the power holders. So during apartheid, it was own affairs referring to whites and other affairs referring to Black people. So the apartheid government was both racist and sexist. So you had white males being portrayed as heroes, and Black people being sort of like in the way of civilization. So they fought against civilization more than their rights. That's how it was portrayed. And in the democratic era, what happened was there were policies to redress past imbalances. But when that was done, the activism of women still took a back seat. So what happened in post-apartheid South Africa, you had new heroes who were Black and male. So still not moving completely away from colonial and apartheid narratives. And also you also have Luthuli being one of the new heroes not and in the heritage sector, and that's not how it's represented.
Okay, thanks. I have another question. This is also from Lissa. How did Luthuli die and when? And why didn't he speak his own truth at the time?
It's a great question. I think both Ayanda or I could answer it. Remember when in my lecture, I mentioned that there were a number of lightning rods in my book, but I was only going to mention one. One of the arguments in my book that was really criticized, and even to this day is not liked at all, is that I concluded that Luthuli died as a result of a train accident. He was on a pedestrian bridge, I believe, and I believe this because of evidence, archival evidence, medical records, that Luthuli suffered a stroke while crossing a pedestrian bridge on a narrow footplate. And he was struck by the cabin of a locomotive that came out over this footplate. However, within a highly contested liberation movement, every country and every liberation movement needs martyrs. So of course, as soon as Luthuli died, it was immediately an assassination. It was immediately the apartheid government did. It was immediately he was murdered. And of course, this narrative is perpetuated to this day. And I understand why, but the evidence just is not there at all. So I conclude that Luthuli died as a result of a accident with a train while a pedestrian. I think that answers one question, but it is contested by many. What was the other part of your question, Claire? Sorry, you're muted.
No, I got it. Why did he not speak his own truth
yes,
at the time?
Got it. Okay, there's two reasons. In 1962, the apartheid regime legislated what was called the Sabotage Act. The Sabotage Act, as I said, made it illegal to even quote Luthuli. So Luthuli couldn't speak out one way or the other. And I also mentioned you couldn't even publish his image in a newspaper. And remember, in 1960, the ANC and the Communist Party and many other parties were declared illegal. So they could only meet underground. So it wasn't like the ANC could have meetings and have these public declarations and sort of declare what their positions were on any given issue. So you had a silence imposed by the apartheid regime, both in terms of Luthuli as the leader and in terms of the ANC. However, Luthuli was able to speak through missionaries. Luthuli was able to speak through, for example, public communications with that he had in cooperation with Martin Luther King Jr. There are evidences of Luthuli's voice sneaking out, if you will. And this is what I use in order to sort of prove that Luthuli very much still advocated for a nonviolent strategy. To conclude your answer, I would say also that, remember, in my lecture, I kept saying Luthuli is a Democrat. Now, the ANC had a meeting outside of South Africa after Mandela launched the armed movement, and the ANC decided democratically to follow the armed movement after the fact, after Mandela already launched the bombs. But Luthuli was not going to speak against a democratically held position. He was a Democrat, and he was living by the principles that he espoused. He was not going to publicly speak against the party that democratically decided on a given course of action, even if he disagreed with it.
Okay, we have a question from Marnie Rosner, which is, why do you think that the USA or the West would have allowed Luthuli to lead a peaceful transition of power, given the 1960 murder of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, sponsored, of course, by the CIA?
Yeah, it's a good question. If you see, the thing is that the apartheid regime was always able to sort of go against the ANC because of the communist boogeyman. And as long as the ANC allied itself with the Soviet bloc, you were going to have the Western democracies ally themselves with whatever entity is against communism. And we saw this in Chile with Pinochet. We saw this with Marcos, I believe, in the Philippines. Yes, we saw this with Mobutu in Zaire. The Western democracies would ally themselves with Satan as long as Satan was against communism. And unfortunately, that's where Mandela and those who opted for the armed movement, they placed themselves within the bosom of the communist bloc, which I believe permanently, at least until the wall fell, caused the ANC to be on the losing side. As soon as the wall fell, the communist boogeyman fell, and then the Western democracies were able to support the ANC. So I believe that if Luthuli was able to keep the ANC within the liberal democratic orbit, then the Western democracies would have continued to support the ANC and would have imposed all of those sanctions on the apartheid regime in the 70s, long before they started to during the Reagan administration.
Ayanda, I wonder if you could respond to this idea of Scott's that the Soviet alliance delayed liberation of South Africa for so many years. It's a very interesting idea. I'm wondering what you think of it.
Okay, I will stick to the general public view of South Africans in terms of Umkhonto weSizwe. People generally believe that we were not going to receive democracy if it wasn't for MK. People believe generally that pressure that was put on apartheid government was the reason why, and had the ANC not decided to fight fire on fire, the apartheid government wouldn't have gotten the message. Because during that, especially in the 1980s, where most of the apartheid laws collapsed, there was a lot of war in the country. There was a lot of fighting, and another role that was played by the MK is to ensure that ANC members are able to leave the country without being stopped by government, and then that's where they're able to plan for ways of helping the country. And also, so people believe that the role played by the MK and also mass movements within the townships were the main things that led to democracy. And also there were a lot of protests for the release of Mandela. And so those protests and the release of Mandela were some of the key things that eventually led to a democratic country.
Okay, thanks. We have a question from Michael Bosworth, which is, Scott, could you go over again the information from Mandela that came out in 2010? And we have another question that goes with that in a way. You said that you were afraid to read Mandela's biography when it came out because it might reveal that you were wrong about your thesis. but later you say that the truth is absolute and that Luthuli didn't back violence. Is it possible to ever really know what's true?
It's a great question. One has to really look at and make a distinction between the two Mandela texts. One text is A Long Walk to Freedom, which most people are familiar with, that came out in 1994, and it was sort of ghost written. And that Long Walk to Freedom, for example, is sort of like the nationalist honeymoon narrative, in large part written for the Western democracies and their population to just have everybody fall in love with Mandela. Now, the text that came out in 2010 is different in the sense that these are things that Mandela wrote in the 1960s. So they haven't gone through the sort of gauntlet of history making, of mythologized narrative. I mean, just think of it. I mean, like in the United States, you know, George Washington never told a lie, and you know, the whole cut down the cherry tree. All countries have mythologized their national origins to some extent. South Africa isn't unique. My goodness, the United States does it all the time. And we are still mythologizing our own histories. Just look at Thomas Jefferson and the whole, you know, having slaves and procreating with them. So it's not unique to South Africa. But let's go back to the two texts. The reason why I was so worried about the text that was released in 2010 was because it would have archival evidence from the 1960s from Mandela that was newly released that people hadn't seen before. That's what caused me to shake in my boots, because maybe there was evidence I had not seen yet. And right before this lecture, I pulled out the quote from that 2010 Nelson Mandela book that contradicts not only his own book, Long Walk to Freedom, but contradicts the nationalist mythologized narrative. And I'll just read the quote right now. Mandela recalled, and this is Mandela writing, people like Chief Luthuli, like Moses Kotane, like Dr. Monty Naker, all of them were saying, let us not embark on violence. Let us continue with nonviolence. And when they couldn't resist the argument I was putting forward, they said, and listen to this, you go and you start your organization. That's Umkhonto weSizwe. We will not discipline you because we understand why you have taken this line, but don't involve us. We are going to continue with nonviolence. That is Mandela proving my thesis.
Well, that is an excellent note to end on. Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you so much, Ayanda, especially because you're staying up quite late for your time zone. We appreciate it so much. And again, I'll remind everybody that our next event is on March 7th. It's a discussion of Fukushima, the nuclear reactor accident in Japan, and you can register for that on our website. And yeah, thank you so much. I will see you later.